And it's my pleasure to introduce Ron Byrne to introduce our session for today. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Old Testament. We're going to pick up today on some of the more specifics as Eve MacMaster leads us through our kind of examination of the Old Testament. And maybe toward the end, we might even look back to Amos. The book of Amos came up in our first lecture, and a number of us have followed up on Eve's suggestion to read Amos, and maybe we'll do that later, but not now. Eve, it's all yours.
Good evening, afternoon, whatever. Good to be back. Just as a matter of review, the Hebrew Bible includes the Torah, the former prophets, the latter prophets, the 12 minor prophets, and the writings. And everything in these books happens through speech. Not much visual description in the Bible of people or events. One exception I can think of is the flood, but almost everything else it comes through speech. Beginning with creation, God speaks and creatures, plants, and animals come into being. The action is told through speech. The serpent speaks, Eve speaks, and the humans are alienated from God, one another, and the earth. Violence increases, and it's told through speech. Cain invites Abel to come outside, and then he kills him. God confronts Cain. Cain replies. Violence increases between the time of Cain and the time of Noah. The flood story begins with God's instructions to Noah. The Tower of Babel story begins with boasting. Let us make a name for ourselves. God's later promise to Abraham reverses that. I will bless you, and I will make your name great. God makes a new beginning by calling Abraham and makes a covenant with him and renews it with Isaac and Jacob. And through them, he creates a people. Their wives are barren, and it takes divine intervention for them to bear children. That's a common running theme in the Bible. And someone whose birth comes through divine intervention is going to be very special. These are the ancestors of the new people God is creating. These are the people he calls into relationship, the covenant that binds God and people. This covenant, this first covenant, is absolutely unconditional and therefore eternal. It exists today, the covenant between God and the Jewish people. It has not been superseded. There's a heresy among some Christians that God's concern for Christians invalidates the covenant with the Jews. It does not. It's an eternal covenant. However, there's another covenant. The covenant is to give the people land, and that covenant is conditional. The land is theirs as long as they keep their side of the covenant. And when they fail to maintain the righteousness of the Torah, they lose the land. The Genesis story begins with the alienation of... Oh, the Genesis story speaks up. Thank you for telling me. Speak into the mic. It's okay. Whatever.
There we go.
Okay.
That's better.
The covenant story begins with the alienation of God and Eve. God says, have you eaten from the tree I commanded you not to eat? Adam says, the woman you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate. God says to the woman, what have you done? The woman says, the serpent tricked me, and I ate. That's called passing the buck. Abraham bargains with God for saving some people from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's a comical scene of bargaining. He gets God down to 10. If there are 10 righteous people, will you not destroy it? And he barely finds 10. It's very amusing. As Abraham is so close to God that he dares to bargain with him and say, no, 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 don't do that. And God trusts Abraham. Genesis concludes with the reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers, told through speech. Joseph says, God sent me before you to preserve a remnant. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. The story continues and the speech continues as the Hebrews are enslaved in Egypt. The king of Egypt says to the Hebrew midwives, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king commanded, and they let the boys live. You may remember that one of those boys was Moses. In the next section, next book of the Bible, Exodus, it begins with the Hebrews enslaved in Egypt, where the king of Egypt said that to the Hebrew midwives. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives, very sharp-witted, said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes. The next section is a story of baby Moses, a second ark to save the people. The basket he's put into is called an ark. There's certain verbal themes running through the Bible stories. Remember the ark that saved Noah and his family from the flood. So the word for the basket is also ark. And the next section, the adult Moses escapes from Egypt after murdering an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew. And he meets the daughters of Jethro at a well. Now that is a scene repeated in the meetings of Rachel and Jacob. Jacob comes to a well, and there is Rachel. Abraham sends his servant to find a bride for Isaac, and he finds Rebekah coming to the well. And there's a New Testament story that echoes that. You may remember the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. And Jesus doesn't find a bride, but he has a fruitful encounter with some Samaritans. Moses is called by a voice from a burning bush, and he's a very reluctant prophet. All of the prophets are reluctant. That's a sign of being authentic, actually. And when he was called from the voice from the burning bush, called to go to Pharaoh, he said, who am I to go to Pharaoh? But suppose the Israelites don't believe me when I tell them you appeared to me and sent me. And God tells him to show some signs and makes it possible for him to create spectacular events with his staff. And then you remember Moses' confrontation with Pharaoh, the 10 plagues and God's power over Pharaoh, and how the Israelites escaped from Egypt, and how they went to the Sinai, where God made a covenant with them and gave them the law. It's important to remember that the word law is very misleading. It's teaching. Torah, the proper uh, translation for Torah, is teaching, because law has other connotations. And the next section of the Bible is Leviticus, which is about how to properly worship, with instructions on life. And the commandments to love your neighbor doesn't come from Jesus, it comes from Leviticus. Love your neighbor as yourself, and care for the stranger, for resident aliens, all those migrants that we're treating so badly. We are commanded, it's a commandment from God to take care of people who come from other places and treat them well. And the next section is Numbers, which tells the story of how the Israelites went from Sinai to Canaan. Quite an exciting story, again, told mostly in speech. And then the next book is Deuteronomy, which is a summary of the teaching of Moses in his farewell speech. You remember, he ends at, there are two paths, life or death. Choose life. Well, since Eve means life, I like that. Choose Eve. I even had a choose life license plate until it was pointed out to me what other people read into it. I thought it said choose Eve. The next section is the former prophets, Joshua and Judges. Joshua, the book of Joshua, is the one book taught in the Israeli schools. And you can imagine why. It's the account of the conquest of the land of Canaan by the Israelites. It's a good thing the leaders and wise men of Israel decided that the children should know that God commands them to come in, take over the land. The story of the entering and conquering of the land, like most of the stories in the Bible, is told through speech. It begins with a speech of an angel to Joshua as he prepares to lead the people. And then the speeches of Joshua to the people and his instruction to spies that he sends out to check out the land before he leads the people across. And then the distribution of the land to the 12 tribes, or the 11 tribes, with the Levites not getting land. And then the renewal of the covenant right before they cross over. The book of Judges tells stories of 12 leaders, one from every tribe. You see how artificial some of the arrangements are. 12 leaders, one from every tribe, and each one saves the Israelites from enemies. The Hebrews who put their Bible together, were very comfortable with the idea that most of this was not historical, but it upset the people who put together the Christian version of the Old Testament. But these all save the Israelites from the enemies. And the Old Testament inserts the book of Ruth here, thinking that's historical, which it's not. It's like a little novel. But it makes mention that this happened in the time of the judges. So it's inserted it's inserted in Judges and interrupting the flow from Judges. Silence your cell phones. It's very irritating. It probably can't wait. It probably can wait. But the Old Testament inserts Ruth, spoiling the flow from Judges to Samuel. Judges ends with a bloody civil war, total chaos. What are the people going to do? And God sends Samuel, the prophet, who, like all important people in the Bible, experiences a miraculous birth. You may remember the story. His father had two wives, and the mother of the future mother of Samuel was barren, and she was seen by the prophet Eli as and he thought she was drunk, and she explained that she was so sad she couldn't have a child, and he said a prayer. God intervened, and brought the birth of Samuel, a very significant person. That's a repeated pattern. Sarah was barren, and God intervened to provide the birth of Isaac. Rebecca was barren, and again, it took divine intervention. So these are really special people. Samuel was the last judge, and he's leading Israel when the people come to him and ask for a king. We want to be like other nations. They have kings. We want a king. He says that's a very bad idea, and tells them how the king will draft their sons into the army and make their daughters serve the king. He warns them, but then he finds a king. And the first one doesn't work out too well. You remember the story of Saul. There's a lot of comedy in the Bible. And Saul goes out to find his father's lost donkeys and ends up being anointed as king. It's subtle humor, just based on the absurdity of some situations. And a lot of the humor is in the names, the naming of the people, and that's lost because of the translation problems. But Saul makes a terrible king. So Samuel secretly anoints David. He does it in secret because if Saul hears of it, as Samuel says, if Saul hears of it, he will kill me. Now, there are two stories of David meeting Saul. One of the characteristics of the Bible is there are often two stories. There are two stories of the flood. In one story, Noah is told to bring in 2 of every animal. And one story, he's told to also bring in 7 of the animals that are used for sacrifice. And the way they put the Bible together is they included both stories. One story good, 2 stories better. So there are 2 stories of David's meeting Saul. In the first one, Saul is having a bad day, so he sends for David to come and play the lyre. And in the other story, David is visiting his brothers at an army camp where they are. And he finds, when he gets there, that the Israelites are terrified of the Philistine giant, Goliath. So he takes it upon himself to go out to meet Goliath. And he was offered armor. He clattered around and it didn't fit. It was too big. And he took the armor off and he went to meet Goliath, as you may remember the story, with 5 smooth stones. And he goes against Goliath and he kills him. There's another version of the story in the ending, the sort of appendix to that book, where it's David's brother who kills Goliath. They don't sit down, they don't work like modern editors to take the best story, they just print them all. And this is also, this section also includes a second story of how Saul meets David. And when David kills Goliath, Saul inquires, whose son is this young man? As if he hadn't already met him. Now, there's a very complex relationship between Saul and David. This whole section has been printed up as a separate book. It reads like a novel. I remember when I first read it carefully, I thought this would make a great movie. They make Bible movies, but they mess them up. They add sex and violence, and there really is enough already, but they improve the stories. They make a mess of the Ten Commandments. But Saul's son Jonathan loves David. Everybody loves David. Many people love David. But David doesn't love anyone. David uses people, and when it's inconvenient, he dismisses them. The second Samuel deals with David plotting his way to being king. And he achieves that. He has people kill his rivals. And he unites the north and the south kingdoms, Israel and Judah. He has no compunction about murdering his rivals. And Saul dies on the battlefield with Jonathan, and David becomes king. Now, the next section is the struggle for succession. David's on his deathbed, and the prophet Nathan and one of David's wives, Bathsheba, are plotting about to have Solomon proclaimed king. Bathsheba's the mother of Solomon, but not the eldest son. So there's some machination here. He said these are great stories. If they would just deal with them the way they are written, they would make wonderful movies. The next section is the latter prophets. And the Old Testament puts these prophets after the Song of Songs and calls it the Song of Solomon. And then the classic prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And the Old Testament inserts Lamentations after Jeremiah because Lamentations is credited to Jeremiah, but there's no proof that Jeremiah wrote it. And Lamentations is read by the Jews on the anniversary of the day of the destruction of the temple. The other major prophet is Ezekiel. Not much read in Christian church. It's got great stories. Ezekiel acts out his prophecies in a very strange ways. He lies on his side, speaking to a brick. And then he turns on his other side. He was forecasting the destruction of Jerusalem, which he had seen in visions. I think there's only one section of Ezekiel that's in the Christian lectionary liturgy. But the Old Testament inserts Daniel after Ezekiel and puts both Daniel and Ezekiel after Lamentations. But Daniel is not a prophet. Daniel is apocalyptic. It's has those wonderful stories in the first half, and then the second half is about the possible future. The next section is the 12 minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, the Old Testament moves the minor prophets to the end, in order to go directly from the ending of Malachi to the preaching of John the Baptist, making it seem perfectly natural that the Old Testament leads right into the coming of Jesus, who's introduced by John the Baptist. And the everything else section is called the writings, Psalms and Proverbs. But the Old Testament puts Psalms and Proverbs after Ecclesiastes with the idea that the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes were both written by Solomon. And Job, the Old Testament puts Job after Esther, and then the five scrolls, 5 short books. The Old Testament calls the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, and puts it after Ecclesiastes, and it is read at Passover. The book of Ruth is read at the Feast of Weeks, which is a harvest festival, because you may remember the story of Ruth is set at the grain harvest, where she's a immigrant woman from a hostile country who goes out to gather leftovers in the field because she's living with her mother-in-law and they're very poor. Lamentations is read at the Day of Atonement. Ecclesiastes is read at the Feast of Tabernacles, and Esther is read at the Feast of Purim, which is another wonderful story. And the next section of the writings is Daniel, who is not a prophet, Ezra and Nehemiah, which are actually historical accounts of the return from captivity, the return to Jerusalem. And then Chronicles, and the ending expresses the Jewish hope for the return to Jerusalem. It ends with the last king being granted being treated much better by those who have captured him, and hoping for the return to Jerusalem. So the trajectory of the Hebrew Bible looks toward the return to Jerusalem, next year in Jerusalem. The Old Testament, not surprisingly, ends with the prophet Malachi, which leads into Matthew's Gospel, which begins the story of Jesus as a continuation of the Hebrew Bible by beginning with Matthew. Why Matthew? With Abraham, the summary of the history of Israel, and the other 3 Gospels begin very differently. You may remember, well, it's not relevant to this, but looking this up, I found it absolutely fascinating. I had no idea. The books are the same. The words, the content of the books is not, but putting them in a different order changes their meaning. And I invite your response. Yes, I did what I did last week and finished up before a half hour. So I invite your comments on this or any questions you may have.
Any questions? Yes,
Anything you found surprising? Yeah.
that's
Yeah, question, about when do you think, or do people think the Hebrew Bible was finished, written?
Dave?
My brain is jelly because I know you're listening and I don't have a snappy answer. When was it written? When was it finished? Offhand, yes. Well, what's the oldest part?
Well, were the books were probably written individually,
Oh,
weren't they?
absolutely.
And so would the last book then be Malachi?
No, that's in the Christian arrangement. The
Which one would it be
last
then?
book in the Jewish arrangement is Second Chronicles,
Second Chronicles.
right? And I don't know. Yes. Yes, thank you. Um, the Bible basically, the Jewish Bible was basically composed during the exile. And a lot of the theology was developed during the exile. It was a very creative period. It's a time of suffering. Book of Job comes out of that. But that is when the Bible essentially was created. Yes, thank you.
Well, so the early books were, do you think they were written during that time as well?
No, the
Like
Torah-
from memory
No,
or
the Torah was older.
what?
The Torah was older. That was how it was a rule book on how to live, and they had that. But when each time of writing, for each of them,
Speaking of the mic.
the time of writing for each of them, I can't pull. Richard, can you help? We talk about this, and I'm not pulling it out of my memory. Right. Right. Around 500 BC, the destruction of Jerusalem.
Hello. I say it's after the destruction of Jerusalem in the 500s BC that the various bits came together or began to come together, and there was evidently a great deal of editing that goes on in some of the older texts, so that things are commanded in the time of Abraham or even earlier that would not have made sense until much later.
One of the reasons that there are duplicates of stories is that the people who were in exile came from two different places. So they had two different there were two oral traditions from the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So they put the stories from Judah and the stories from Israel together. They didn't choose between them. Yeah.
There were also the two Bibles, the Bible originally, and then the Babylonian Bible.
I'm sorry, the two what?
The two versions of the Bible were different, the original and then the Babylonian Bible, which was the Bible written in exile.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There were also things about the translations. Oh, I'm sorry. things about the translations, which I don't know, maybe you'll go into in that fifth version of, session when it's gonna be about translation, right? And particularly the one that sticks out always in my mind is the giving of the Ten Commandments, where in all the translations, it says, "Thou shalt not kill," which is really "Thou shalt not murder."
Right.
And there are so many of those. Is that what you're going to go into at that point?
Well, that hits on the whole issue of translation. Um,
Well,
My
because
favorite-
there's
my-
such different
yes.
meanings.
yes,
And it goes throughout the Bible.
right. My favorite translation of the Bible is made by Robert Alter, who's a retired professor of comparative literature at Stanford. And he speaks and writes Hebrew. He's Jewish, and he knows, and he translates with great wisdom. And if you're looking for a translation, he's translated the whole Old Testament in 3 volumes, and it's absolutely the best.
What was his source? Did he go back to the original text then?
Oh yeah, he's totally literate in Hebrew, and the second best one would be the King James Bible is much more literal and accurate. It was done by a committee, and as they were translating, they would read it out loud, which is one of the reasons it's so beautiful. And Robert Alter wrote a book about the King James Bible. He's a big fan, calling it, I think, Pen of Iron. But what his take on why it was so good. It has some very strange, to our ears, translations, which have been covered over in modern translations. My bowels turn when I'm upset, things like that, literal, very earthy kinds of things, and much closer, much closer to the original. So many translations smooth out the difficulties. Yeah,
Smooth things, yeah.
yeah, and really are quite far from what the text is trying. Well, there's translating to make it accessible to the reader, and there's translating, making it faithful to the original.
Mhm.
And those that are, there are a lot of modern translations that are way off base, trying to make it simple and easy to read.
I think there's a question on Zoom.
Hi, Barb, go ahead.
Okay, yep. I did a lot of studying in Israel and with priests and ministers too at the Hebrew Union College. One Alter is a very good translation, but also Fox from Harvard is an excellent translation, and he attributes words to where they were used in ancient civilizations around that time period. Very interesting if anybody's interested in that kind of thing. And then we know that there were very early Torah, which is not exactly the same as the Old Testament. The Torah, very early translations. The Torah was not written down, as you know, for many centuries, and was read to the people over and over as stories. And that, as you said, when they went to write it down, when there were 2 stories, can you picture them sitting around going, well, we just, that maybe there were 5 stories and they got down to 2. Well, we can't make up our minds, so we'll put them both in. I love that. And as far as the order, the order of the Torah is the same as we do each year, but the prophets, if you look at various translations or Hebrew and English translations used in various synagogues, you're going to find that some of the prophets are read in order because they're historically in order, but the other ones are not, and they would appear in different orders just depending what book they're in, and they're not ordered. But oh, this could go on. I'll get off my soapbox. Thank you very much.
Thanks, that was very helpful. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
I would like to ask whether this is an appropriate time for this question. And if it's not an appropriate time, then we'll bring it up later on sometime. So this is a comparison of the energies, if you say, or you could say, or the thrust of the Old Testament compared to the New Testament. And if that's not the proper subject, then we won't discuss that right now. But at least some people would have it that the Old Testament has a greater emphasis on justice, and the New Testament has a greater estimate on mercy. If you would agree with that or not. And secondly, that the Old Testament has a greater emphasis on tribalism and land possession, whereas the New Testament has a greater emphasis on the incorporation of God's domination, or other words would fit well, over the entire creation.
Okay, there's two parts.
Speak up, get in the mic.
Two parts. Yes, there's a great emphasis. Well, the New Testament, Jesus assumes the Hebrew understanding. A lot of what he says is just a restatement of the Hebrew Bible, and absolutely, he's assuming the concern for justice. Absolutely. But it's an assumption that you already know that. I forget it. And on mercy, absolutely, mercy's all over the Old Testament. Where's that? What is that quote? Well, there are several. What does God require of you but to love justice, do mercy, and walk humbly with your God? Absolutely. There's no difference. What was your other question? The Old Testament is concerned. Yeah, it is tribal. It's very concerned with. Well, it's very concerned with with Israel. It's Israel's story and the promise of the land. And as I said, the promise of the land is conditional, and the current regime in Israel is not just. I would say no. They're not living Torah. They're being very cruel to the indigenous people. I mean, I say that without apology. But they're still God's people, whether they're just or unjust. They will always be God's people. And there is this very nasty anti-Semitic slur that it's called supersessionism, that God has transferred his concern from the Jews to the Christians, and that's absolutely not true. The covenant with Israel is forever, no matter what Israel does. God loves Israel. But the covenant on the land is conditional. And in order to keep the land, they must practice justice. And I don't think you could make a case for the current regime in Jerusalem to be practicing justice. But there are two kinds of covenants. But the anti-Semitic lie, which led right to the Holocaust, was that God didn't care about the Jews anymore. That's absolutely not true.
Thank you so much. I have a question about the canonization of the Jewish Bible. And we know that it took place somewhere around the 4th century BCE. But what canonization means is what's included and what's excluded. And we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that there are a number of books that just didn't make it in. And I'm wondering how this was treated by the time the first translation of the Jewish Bible into Greek took place somewhere around the 2nd century.
Well, I know that there took a long time to canonize Esther because it never mentions God. There are two. There's another one.
Get
What was
close
it?
to the mic.
There's another one that doesn't mention God. So there was, it wasn't very clear on a couple of the,
Do we know what happened to some of those books that came up in the Dead Sea Scrolls? What's their status now if they didn't make it into the Old Testament?
Well, there is a section called the Apocrypha, which basically are the ones written in Aramaic,
Yes.
and the pseudepigrapha. I mean, there are all kinds of books floating around that didn't make it. Yes.
To respond to Rick, the Apocrypha, which are included in Catholic Bibles in translations, were not written in Hebrew.
That's
So
one. Yes.
the Septuagint, the first translation from Hebrew into Greek, said, okay, these things that are in other languages, they may be valid, but they're not part of the real Hebrew Bible.
A footnote on that. By the time as time went by, the Jews stopped speaking Hebrew and began to speak Aramaic, and they didn't understand Hebrew, and they had the Bible translated into Greek, and that creates a theological problem for Christians. In the Hebrew Bible, there is a prophecy of a young woman will bear a child. And in the Greek translation, it says the virgin will bear a child. It's Parthenon is the word. So the basis for the Christian teaching of the virgin birth comes from a misunderstanding. Yes, I mean, it's, a shocking point, but that is
Yeah.
not what, it's
I
not
would
what the
say it
Hebrew
is
Bible
shocking.
says.
Yes. Anything else? Yes.
I'm a little confused, but anyway, the Torah is the Jewish Bible or the
No,
Hebrew
it's the first part of the Jewish Bible.
Yeah, right. And then the New Testament mirrors that. And somebody changed it or added to it or so it's not, they're not exactly the same. Do we know how that came about?
The last part of what you said?
The two aren't the same. In other
No,
words,
no,
there are
they're not.
differences. Do we know how the differences came about? Who rewrote it, if you will?
Well, the order of the books is different. The content of the books is exactly the same. But but the Jewish Bible has an understanding of genre of literature, and the Christian Bible is very confused about genre and about time. I mean, I would say that the Jewish Bible arrangement makes more sense. and you know, but the Christians were attempting to put it into what they thought was historically accurate time, based partly on the misconception that everything in it really happened. And the Jews had this understanding of, hey, people, these are stories. Right?
There's something else on Zoom, Julianne?
Okay, hi Barb, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, about 2,300 years ago, the Greek Egyptian Emperor Ptolemy was the one who ordered the Jewish sages to render the Torah into Greek. He did this on 2 separate occasions. That's all.
Can you elaborate a little bit?
Hang on, let's see if I can. Okay, the first time he had 5 scholars carry out the translation. The second time he assembled 72 scholars, put them in separate rooms, had them do their simultaneous Greek translations, and they supposedly produced the same version. I doubt that one. And there's some ancient rabbinic sources which back this up and tell the stories. Of course, there's more than one, as usual. You know, we just have we have a lot of Talmud, the discussions, and there was, as you mentioned, there were 2 Talmudic schools, one in Jerusalem and one in Babylon and Babylonia, and they would sometimes disagree.
Do I get a? Yeah. I just like to pick up on that in that whole question of, are there 2 stories in a narrative, that I know when I forget which festival it is, but when the festival, it's the giving of the Torah, and one of the parts of this is to read scripture all night. That it was attending such a service with friends of ours that I learned that the whole rabbinic tradition is very comfortable with saying, yes, this, well, yes, that. And that other thing, yeah, sure. And the Christian tradition has tended to say, well, there's only one reading.
Yes, yes,
So if it says this, it must mean that.
yes.
It can't mean that. And we somehow have to find a way to jam these things together so that, just for example, as we just had Palm Sunday, but in one gospel, Jesus is riding a donkey, and at the same time, it's quoting an Old Testament line about riding on the colt. So the gospel writer has actually put it together so that he must have been coming in astride 2 different animals at the same time, which would be quite a feat in itself. But it's that different mindset that says there's only one way to look at this. No, there are many ways.
I have 2 comments on that. It was just parallelism in speech on a donkey, comma, the colt of a donkey. I mean, it's just stupid to think that was 2 donkeys. And the other comment was how we really enjoyed that Bible study, and the honest understanding there are many ways to read a text. We thought that was excellent. And it was this rabbi said this and that rabbi said that. And I thought that was really a good way to look at things because that's reality. And it's, Jewish scripture study. So you can learn a lot from other traditions. Yes.
Okay, Barb, go ahead.
Yeah, the holiday is Shavuot, and and if you look at the Mishnah and the Talmud, you find it will say right there from Rabbi so and so's text, and it will tell you what they thought, and then this other rabbi thought something else. This other rabbi thought something else, and when we study this together, and when rabbis study together, well, when people study together to become rabbis, they study in twos usually, and the whole idea is to come up with different thoughts, and we argue all the time, but you listen to the other person, and in that way you grow and you change, and each year you may come up with something different because you are different each year.
Yeah, I like that very much, as opposed to Christian writing of creedal statements, which I hate. It's like you really know. Yes, it's a very attractive way of reading things.
That really makes the Old Testament live a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's alive and changing.
Yeah,
Interpretations are changing.
okay. I think we're getting close with one last question here. Yeah.
So this is a question about reality-based versus metaphorically based understanding of the Old Testament. So recent scientists have relatively powerful, primarily DNA, but some historical information about the origin of Homo sapiens from Africa somewhere between 40 and 70,000 years ago, spreading then through Asia, the Mediterranean, Northern Africa, and the rest of the contiguous lands. And so there is that information that's primarily scientific and not aimed to be religious in any way about the origins of mankind. And then there is the story of Adam and Eve and the creation. And my question is, if you have information, or anyone in the audience, about whether the Jewish first understandings of Genesis was reality-based and in a way the reason that the Jews were then God's chosen people, or were there any people in antiquity in the Jewish tradition who really considered this more metaphorical?
Well, I have a comment on your categories. You're opposing metaphor to reality. Reality is not necessarily factual. A painting can be more true than a photograph, but a photograph is more factual. Associating factuality with truth is a modernist error that, and you can twist facts, you can present facts in ways that make them lies. And metaphors are a deeper kind of truth. Absolutely, but metaphors are not counterfactual. It's a different way of expressing truth. It's enlightenment understanding. Pre-enlightenment people didn't think that way, but we're taught by the Enlightenment, modern rationalism, that truth is factual. And that's not the case. Truth is deeper than facts. Poets express truth. Painters express truth. Photographs express factuality. Telephone book is full of facts. I don't know you if I know all the facts about you, your shoe size, where you were born. I could know all kinds of facts about you and be totally ignorant about who you really were, so that they're not the same. I could meet you, you could be my friend. I could be clueless about your shoe size and where you went to school. It's a different kind of reality.
Oh, with that, I think we'll wrap it up for today. This has been a really excellent discussion
Well,
today,
I appreciate the smart and challenging questions.
yeah. So join us.
Especially the ones I don't agree
Join
with.
us next week. Do you have any little preview of what you're going to be?
Remind me. What did I say? I keep changing this as I go along.
That's all right.
Oh, it's on,
Get close to the mic.
it's on narrative, isn't it?
Next week is narrative. Characteristics of Hebrew narrative, the universal history and the history of Israel, examples of conversation between books.
Oh, that's, yeah.
Another way of looking at the same,
Yeah.
another way of looking at the same stuff.
yeah. Well, I think this was fun. Come back next week. Thanks. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. You did a good job.